My name is Emily Carter, and I live in a modest Cape-style cottage on the outskirts of a small Massachusetts town not far from the Vermont border. The place is postcard perfect. Winding roads lined with sugar maples, old colonial homes with steep roofs and wood smoke drifting from their chimneys, and a main street where every shop has been there for decades. It's the kind of town where you might still find homemade candy canes at the local confectioners and see hand-painted signs advertising wreaths and evergreen garlands for sale. I ended up here 2 years ago, fleeing the frantic bustle of Boston in search of something quieter and more genuine. At 32, I wanted a life that was simpler, where I could do my freelance graphic design work from a home office overlooking snow-laden pines. I wanted a place where I could watch the seasons change slowly and deliberately. As December deepened, I found myself once again spending the holidays alone. My family was scattered across the country. My parents retired to California, my brothers raising families in Chicago and Houston. Traveling home had become expensive and draining. Instead, I chose to embrace my solitude, telling myself that this year would be cozy and meaningful. After all, New England's Christmas atmosphere was something special. Evenings lit by candles in window panes, the scent of mulled cider and evergreen boughs, and snow falling so softly you could hear the hush of the world settling in for the longest nights. On the second week of December, as the days shortened and the evenings stretched like long blue shadows, I decided to decorate my yard more elaborately than I had before. My cottage stands on a small lot with a white picket fence along the front and a few old oak and pine trees marking the edges. I strung colored lights along the porch railings, hung a wreath on the door, and placed a small potted spruce beside the steps. In this town, it was common for people to deck their homes out with twinkling lights, oversized candy canes stuck in the snowbanks, and inflatable Santa Clauses. My own decorations were modest, but tasteful. White and red lights mingled with golden stars, and I scattered a few lanterns with battery-powered candles along the walkway. Standing in the crisp evening air, I felt proud of my little display, imagining how it must look from the street, a warm, welcoming glow in the December darkness. It was around 5 days before Christmas when I first noticed something strange. I had finished work late in the evening and settled near the front window with a cup of peppermint tea. Outside, fresh snow had begun to fall, tiny crystals shining in the glow of my porch lights. The landscape looked serene, and I was thinking about calling my parents the next day to wish them an early Merry Christmas. As my gaze drifted toward the fence line, I thought I caught a hint of movement, just a vague shift of shadow near the old oak tree. I squinted, pressing my nose to the chilly glass. Perhaps it was just the wind stirring a branch. After a moment, I shook my head and turned away, dismissing it as my imagination. But the next night, something felt off again. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I had turned off most of the indoor lights so I could enjoy the gentle glow from outside. That's when I saw it. A figure, unmistakably human-shaped, standing at the edge of my yard, well away from the lights, where the darkness pooled thickly beneath the branches. My heart skipped. Could it be a neighbor? But who stands silently in another person's yard at that hour? I leaned closer, straining to make out details. The figure seemed tall and motionless, like a statue carved from black ice. I couldn't see a face, or even clothing, just an outline darker than the night around it. After a few seconds, it slipped back into the deeper shadows, vanishing so smoothly I questioned if it had ever been there at all. My heart was pounding. I double-checked the locks on my door, drew the curtains, and told myself it must have been a trick of the light or a passing stranger who realized they were trespassing. Still, I went to bed feeling uneasy. Sleep did not come easily, and when it did, my dreams were filled with silent shapes drifting in snowy woods. On the following morning, December 22nd, I ventured into town for some groceries. Snowplows had cleared the streets, and the sidewalks were lined with dirty drifts. The local shops were bustling with last-minute shoppers buying stocking stuffers and Christmas hams. I stopped into the general store, where Mrs. Bailey stood behind the counter. She was a cheerful woman in her 50s who seemed to know everyone's business, though never in a mean-spirited way. I lingered, debating if I should mention what I'd seen. In a small town, rumors spread quickly, and I didn't want to be labeled as the paranoid newcomer. Instead, I asked if the town ever had any Christmas ghost stories. Mrs. Bailey raised her eyebrows, amused. Ghost stories? Here in Snowbridge Hollow, we have plenty of local legends. Some say decades ago, a lumberjack went missing on Christmas Eve and still wanders the woods. Others claim to see strange lights in old barns. We've got enough tales to fill a book. She smiled. What makes you ask? I shrugged, feigning casual interest. I've just been curious about local folklore. You know, getting into the Christmas spirit in my own way. She nodded, and I excused myself, feeling a bit more rattled. So there were old stories. Many small towns had them, of course. That evening, I decided I needed to be absolutely sure of what I was seeing. I turned off all lights inside, sat silently by the front window, and waited. The town was quiet, a few distant cars, the faint smell of someone burning wood in a fireplace. Around midnight, I saw the figure again. This time, it stood closer to my home, perhaps only 15 feet from the porch steps. The Christmas lights illuminated the snow around it, but the figure remained in shadow, as if it carried darkness with it. My chest tightened as I tried to distinguish features. It seemed tall, with shoulders that tapered down to a narrower waist, and maybe wearing a long coat. There was something old-fashioned in its stance, like a silhouette from a bygone era. I swallowed hard. Should I turn on the porch light? Should I open the door and shout? Before I could decide, the figure drifted back, disappearing into the gloom near my fence. I rushed to the door and flipped on the outside floodlight. The yard lit up in a stark, cold glow. Nothing. Not a single footprint in the pristine snow. That was impossible. Anyone who stood there should have left tracks. I stepped outside, my boots crunching as I examined the spot. The snow lay smooth and undisturbed. My breath plumed white in the air. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I spent half the night awake, researching local legends on my laptop. Among old newspaper clippings and town history pages, I found mention of a man named William Havers, Bill to his friends, who had gone missing during a severe snowstorm in December 1941. He was a seasonal worker at a local lumber yard that supplied Christmas trees to nearby towns. Rumor had it he was trying to make a delivery on Christmas Eve and never returned. The search parties failed to find his body. Some locals whispered that his spirit lingered, lost between the worlds of past and present, trying to complete his final errand. My rational mind rebelled against such superstitions. I was a modern, independent woman. I did not believe in ghosts haunting suburban lawns. Yet, how else to explain what I had seen? The impossible vanishing act, the lack of footprints. It was easier to believe I was cracking under holiday loneliness, but I knew what I'd seen. Or not seen. December 23rd came, and with it, a pressing sense of dread. I tried to go about my day, answering client emails, preparing a small batch of gingerbread cookies, humming Christmas carols to lift my spirits, but always aware that night would come again. Late that afternoon, I walked to the old church at the end of Main Street. Inside, the pews were decorated with poinsettias and greenery. I sat quietly, inhaling the scent of incense and old wood, as a few people arranged candles for the midnight Christmas Eve service. I was not particularly religious, but I sought comfort there. I dared not ask anyone about the figure explicitly. I just sat, listening to distant choir rehearsals. Christmas hymns drifted softly. O come, Emmanuel, echoing in the rafters. I left the church feeling a bit calmer, but still uncertain. That night, I could hardly breathe from the tension. Around 11, snow began falling heavily, big flakes that settled silently. I peered out through a crack in the curtains, my heart hammering. He would come, I was certain. The figure, if it was Bill or someone else, seemed drawn to my lights or my presence. Midnight struck, and as if on cue, he appeared again, now standing directly beneath the old oak tree. The tree's branches were heavy with snow, and Christmas lights cast strange patterns on the trunk. The figure raised what seemed to be an arm, then lowered it, a hesitant gesture that chilled me more than anything so far. This was no random haunting. It seemed aware of me. Summoning every ounce of courage, I opened the window slightly and called out into the night. "Who are you? What do you want?" My voice trembled. The figure did not move, not at first. Then, as I watched, it stepped forward into a patch of dim light. For a brief instant, I saw something. Old boots and a coat, maybe a brimmed hat pulled low, and then it was gone, leaving me gasping for air. This was madness. Nothing human vanished like that. I slammed the window shut. My hands shook as I locked it. Perhaps I needed to reach out in some other way. The stories mentioned Bill's disappearance on Christmas Eve. If this was truly him, maybe he needed recognition, a kind of acknowledgement that he existed, that someone remembered or cared. December 24th, Christmas Eve. The entire town seemed wrapped in soft silence. I spent the morning crafting a small token, a bundle of fresh evergreen branches tied with a red ribbon, an old-fashioned Christmas card I found among my stationery, and a small candle. I wrote on the card, "If you are lost, know that I see you, and you are remembered." It felt silly, writing a note to a ghost, but what else could I do? I placed the bundle in a wicker basket and set it gently on my porch steps as dusk fell. Snow glistened everywhere. Through the window, I could see people walking along Main Street, attending church services, heading to family gatherings. The warmth in their laughter stung my heart. So many people together, and me here alone, talking to a phantom. As midnight approached, I sat in darkness, only the glow of the Christmas tree and my porch lights illuminating the scene. I watched the basket on the steps, half expecting it to vanish. Minutes ticked by. The wind whispered across the snow. Suddenly, he was there again, at the edge of the light. My pulse raced, but I kept still. He approached the porch slowly, as if wary. I could barely breathe. The figure halted just before the basket and seemed to study it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, impossibly, I sensed a shift in the air, a subtle lessening of the tension, as if the atmosphere recognized a gesture of peace. I whispered under my breath, "You're not alone this Christmas. I know you're here." And then, something extraordinary, a faint outline, as if moonlight had etched him more clearly. I saw a silhouette of a man from the early 20th century, heavy wool coat, a hat that might have been common in those days. His posture was weary, burdened. My eyes filled with tears unexpectedly. Was I witnessing a man trapped in a loop of time, unable to find rest, reliving his final Christmas Eve? I remembered the old story of Bill Havers, the missing tree delivery man. Maybe he got lost in a blizzard here, never reaching his destination, his life cut short under these very trees. Perhaps he drifted back each year, searching for warmth or acknowledgement. This thought wrenched my heart. Without thinking, I pressed my hand to the cold glass as if to say, "I see you. I'm sorry." The figure bowed its head slightly. Then a soft stirring in the air, and he began to fade. Not violently or suddenly, but gracefully, as if stepping through a veil of falling snow. One moment he was there, the next, only the silent yard remained. I burst into quiet sobs, relief and sadness mingling. Somehow I felt that I had given him what he lacked: recognition, compassion, understanding. Maybe now he could rest. I remained by the window for a long time, watching the basket. It remained untouched, the evergreen branches dusted with snow. I never saw him pick it up, but I believed the gesture mattered. The rest of that night passed peacefully. Outside, I imagined the faint sound of distant carols, the warmth of unseen gatherings. Inside, my heart felt lighter. I fell asleep just before dawn, wrapped in a blanket, my mind filled not with terror but with solemn empathy. On Christmas morning, I woke to a landscape bathed in soft, golden light. The snow had stopped, leaving the world pristine. Bells from the distant church chimed a joyful tune, and I heard neighbors laughing as they emerged to clear their walkways. I stepped outside. My breath caught. The yard looked normal, peaceful. I knelt by the basket, finding it just as I left it. There were still no footprints. I took the basket inside, placing it near the fireplace. It would stay with me, a reminder that we are never truly alone, and that even in darkness, compassion can spark the faintest glow. In the days that followed, I found myself telling no one about the encounter. How could I explain it? People would either think I invented a ghost story to pass the lonely holiday, or they'd politely humor me. Instead, I kept it as a private truth. I visited the local archives again, reading more about Bill Havers. He was described as kind and hardworking, determined to deliver his last batch of Christmas trees despite a coming storm. Friends remembered him as generous. I like to think his wandering spirit simply needed a kind acknowledgement from someone living in the present, a reminder that his effort and existence mattered. As New Year's approached, the memory of that eerie presence no longer filled me with dread, but with a quiet reverence. Life and death, time and memory, all tangled together in this old New England soil. The spirit, if that's what it was, seemed tied to the tradition of Christmas itself, a season that mingles love and longing, memories of those who are gone and hopes for those who remain. Perhaps he came back each December, drawn by the lights and the scents of pine, searching for an anchor to the world he once knew. My small gesture, a basket of greens and a note of acknowledgement, had broken a cycle that lasted decades. I continued to decorate my yard each Christmas after that. Friends visited occasionally. I joined a community choir, singing carols in the frosty air, forging new connections so I wouldn't always be alone. Yet on the quietest nights of winter, when snow drifted across the fields and the moon turned the landscape into a silver dream, I'd think of him. I'd imagine a gentle spirit at peace, drifting away into the starry darkness, freed from the endless loop of searching and fading. Perhaps he found his way home. In a corner of my living room, I kept that evergreen bundle, now dried and brittle, preserved under a glass dome. It reminded me that kindness and empathy can transcend boundaries, even those between the living and the dead. It reminded me that as human beings, we are connected to the stories of those who came before, woven into the same tapestry of place and memory. It reminded me that Christmas, beyond presents and feasts, is a time of gentle miracles, quiet compassion, and the possibility of healing old wounds. I never saw the dark figure again, but I sensed that he left something behind, a subtle grace that settled over my home. The winters that followed felt softer, the nights less intimidating. I no longer feared that stretch of darkness before Christmas morning. Instead, I embraced it as a time of reflection and gratitude. I realized that the loneliness I had felt was not the absence of others, but the absence of meaning and connection. By opening my heart to that restless spirit, I had opened a door within myself, discovering a depth of feeling and understanding I never knew I possessed. And so, each Christmas, when I light my porch with soft colors and sip hot cocoa by the window, I take a moment to whisper into the silent night, "Merry Christmas, Bill, wherever you are." Maybe, just maybe, the wind carries my words into the stillness. Maybe the stars flicker in acknowledgement. There's no fear now, only warmth, memory, and the faint echo of a past that finally found its rest in the hush of a New England winter's eve.